Imagine a young nun, her voice silenced forever, not by God but by the cruel hands of men. In a quiet convent in 17th century Italy, whispers still echo through the cold stone walls. A woman buried alive, bricked inside her own cell for a sin she never confessed. This was not a legend told to frighten children. It was a reality, a punishment so horrifying that even centuries later it chills the soul. What crime could justify such a fate? Who had the power to condemn a servant of God to a living tomb? Tonight, we open the forgotten archives of history and uncover the terrifying truth of the immured nun, a story of betrayal, silence, and eternal imprisonment. Stay with me, because once you hear it, you'll never forget it. Before we dive into this chilling tale, I want you to imagine the silence of those walls and ask yourself, what would you have done? Comment your thoughts below, share this with someone who loves dark history, and don't forget to subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The story begins in the heart of Italy during the early 1600s, an age when the church held more than just spiritual power. It was the law, the authority, and the keeper of both mercy and cruelty. The convents of that time were not merely places of worship and prayer. For many young women, they were prisons disguised as sanctuaries. Families, eager to preserve wealth, avoid costly dowries, or silence rebellious daughters, often forced girls into religious life. Some went willingly, others unwillingly, but once the vows were taken, escape was nearly impossible. Among the countless stories buried in history, one convent stands apart, its reputation darker than the rest. This was the convent of Santa Lucia, a modest but strict institution in the countryside of northern Italy. It was here that the whispers of an immured nun began. Records are scarce, deliberately erased or hidden, but fragments of testimony, church notes, and local legends allow us to piece together the fate of one woman whose name was said to be Sister Margherita. Margherita had not chosen this life. She was born into a noble but financially struggling family. Her father, desperate to avoid paying a dowry for marriage, sent her to Santa Lucia at the age of 17. For her family, it was practical. For Margherita, it was a sentence. She had loved life outside, the music of festivals, the laughter of her younger brothers, the possibility of marriage, and perhaps even the faint memory of a young man she once met in the town square. But inside the convent, those dreams dissolved into silence. The rules of Santa Lucia were unyielding. The abbess, a woman named Madre Agnese, was known for her severity. She believed discipline was the highest form of devotion. Every misstep, every laugh, every careless word, every forbidden glance was treated as a sin against God. To be a nun under her rule was not only to give up the world, but to erase oneself entirely. Margherita, however, was different. Even within the cold stone walls, her spirit shone. She sang hymns with a voice that carried through the halls, lifting the moods of the other sisters. She secretly wrote in journals, describing her longing for freedom. And according to whispers, she still exchanged glances with a man from the town, a young mason who worked occasionally on the convent's repairs. Their interactions were brief, fleeting, but enough to spark rumors. In the 1600s, for a nun to even imagine a man's affection was considered scandalous. For Madre Agnese, who valued order above compassion, such behavior could not be tolerated. Discipline was one thing, but humiliation was another, and the abbess would not allow her convent's reputation to suffer. One evening during Vespers, Margherita was summoned to the abbess's chamber. The candles flickered against the thick stone walls, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Agnese questioned her with icy calm. "Have you sinned in thought, in word, or in deed?" Margherita, trembling, denied any wrongdoing, but her voice cracked. That crack was enough for suspicion to take root. Over the following weeks, Margherita's freedoms grew thinner. She was watched closely, her writings confiscated, her time alone restricted. The other sisters began to avoid her, fearful that even being seen with her would bring suspicion upon them. Slowly, she was isolated. And then, one night, the whispers claim, she vanished. The official record stated only that Sister Margherita fell gravely ill and was taken into deep seclusion for penance. But villagers who lived near the convent told another story. They swore they heard muffled cries at night, cries that seemed to come from behind the convent walls themselves. The masons, summoned to work at odd hours, were instructed to seal an unused cell in the lower cloister. They were forbidden to ask questions, and when they worked, they heard the faintest sound from inside, pounding, begging, prayers. One mason, racked with guilt, later confessed that they were told they were building not just a wall, but a tomb for a woman who was still alive inside. If this is true, Margherita was immured, bricked into a tiny cell with no door, no window, only a small slit through which a little air passed. She would have had no food, no water, no light. Her punishment was not swift execution, but slow, suffocating silence. Days, perhaps weeks of fading breath until at last there was only darkness. Why such cruelty? For Madre Agnese and the church leaders who supported her, it was framed as justice. To break her vows was to betray God. To speak against the abbess was rebellion. To harbor longing for the world outside was blasphemy. And so she was erased, literally sealed away, so no trace of her disobedience could stain the convent again. Centuries later, when renovations were carried out at Santa Lucia, workers claimed to have found human remains within one of the sealed walls, bones curled as if the body had tried to claw its way out. Whether this discovery was Margherita's or not, no one could confirm, but for the villagers it was proof of the legend. For them, the story of the immured nun was not simply history, it was a warning. The tragedy of Margherita is not just in her death, but in the silence that followed. No one spoke her name in the convent again. The records buried her under vague words. Even her family never reclaimed her. It was as if she had never existed. But silence cannot erase memory, and memory cannot be bricked away forever. The story spread, whispered among townsfolk, then retold as cautionary tales, then finally recorded by curious historians centuries later. For some, it is a story of cruelty. For others, a story of faith twisted into a weapon. But at its heart, it is the story of a young woman whose only crime was to be human in a world that demanded saints. If you've reached this far, you already know how dark and tragic Sister Margherita's fate was. But what if I told you that her story didn't end with her death? The silence of those walls carried her memory for centuries. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe, share this story with someone who loves forgotten history, and comment below. Do you believe her cries can still be heard in the ruins today? The convent of Santa Lucia did not forget, even if its records claimed otherwise. Officially, Sister Margherita had departed in illness and penance, but the silence left behind was too heavy, too strange. The nuns who had once prayed alongside her avoided speaking her name. The abbess who condemned her moved on with the cold certainty of duty, but whispers travel faster than silence. And so, beyond the convent walls, the story began to take its first steps into legend. It was the masons who carried it first, men who lived by their hands and their tools, who could not erase the sound of pounding fists from behind fresh mortar. One of them, unable to keep the torment locked within his chest, confessed to his wife that he had been ordered to seal a chamber while a living woman begged from the other side. His wife told her sister told her neighbors, and soon the town knew. To speak of it was dangerous, for slandering the convent could bring punishment, but fear has its own way of spreading. In taverns, in hushed tones at market stalls, the villagers asked, what crime could deserve such a death? The church tried to smother the whispers. Priests warned in sermons that gossip was a sin, that those who questioned the holy convent questioned God himself. Yet the warnings only sharpened curiosity. By the turn of the century, parents had turned the story into a tool. They told their children, "Obey, or you will end like the nun in the wall." And the children, shivering at night, would glance toward Santa Lucia's high stone towers, wondering if a pale hand might reach out from the cracks. But the story was not only fear. Among the women of the villages, Margherita's memory became something else, a quiet rebellion. They whispered to each other while washing clothes by the river or baking bread in kitchens, saying, She was one of us. She wanted freedom, and they killed her for it. In those whispers, the immured nun was no longer just a sinner punished by God, but a victim of cruelty, a symbol of how fragile a woman's freedom could be. The years turned to decades, and still her memory clung to the stones. In the 1700s, travelers recorded the legend in journals. A merchant passing through northern Italy wrote of a nun entombed alive for her desires of the world. By then, the details had already shifted. Some said she had loved a priest, others claimed she had spoken against the abbess. Still others insisted she had tried to flee the convent. Legends blur with every telling, but one thread held constant. She had been bricked alive, her cries echoing for days until the silence became permanent. During the Enlightenment, when Europe began questioning blind faith, scholars took interest. Lorenzo Bellini, a Florentine historian, visited Santa Lucia in 1768. He recorded how villagers led him to the convent's lower cloister and pointed at a section of wall. "There," they said, "that is where she sleeps." Bellini, a man of reason, dismissed ghosts, but admitted something about that wall felt oppressive. "It is as though the stones breathe sorrow," he wrote. Even skeptics could not ignore the weight of the place. The legend grew stronger as the church's power weakened in the 19th century. Writers and poets revived the tale, transforming Margherita into a tragic heroine. Painters illustrated her pale figure behind red bricks, her eyes pleading for mercy, her hands raw from scraping. For the Romantics, she was a martyr of love and freedom, punished by the cold machinery of religious authority. For others, she was a cautionary symbol of desire chained by faith. The more art immortalized her, the less she could ever be forgotten. Then came the discovery that shook everything. In the late 1800s, the convent, already centuries old, underwent renovation. Workers repairing the lower cloister broke open part of a wall long left untouched. Behind it, pressed against stone, they found bones. A human skeleton, curled in a fetal shape, its fingers worn and jagged, as though the person had tried to claw their way out. News spread quickly. The church insisted it was nothing unusual, that the remains had simply been placed there by mistake, part of an old burial ground. But the villagers did not believe this. They had been telling the same story for generations. Now they had proof. For them, the immured nun was not only a legend, she was history carved in bone. The skeleton was quietly removed, reburied, and little more was said by officials. But private journals of the workers survive, and their words betray their horror. One man wrote, "The skull was tilted upward, as though in a cry. I cannot sleep for hearing her voice." Another swore he would never work near a convent again, for he believed the curse of the nun followed him home. By the 20th century, the legend had taken on a life far greater than the convent itself. Scholars investigated records of Santa Lucia, uncovering suspicious gaps. Names of sisters vanished without explanation. Certain years showed unusually high numbers of departures, yet no burials were listed in the official registry. The deeper researchers looked, the clearer it became. Margherita's story was not an isolated tragedy. Across Europe, there were fragments of similar accounts. Nuns punished by seclusion, silenced for rebellion, erased by walls. Santa Lucia was only one example, but it was the one with a body behind the stones. Modern historians like Maria Venturi in the 1970s reframed the story not as legend but as testimony. She argued that the immured nun represented a pattern of control within religious institutions. In her book Silent Walls, Venturi wrote, "The immurement of women was not myth but method. To erase a woman was easier than to reform her. To silence one voice was to protect an institution from scandal. And so the walls of our convents are not only built of stone, but of secrets." Today, Santa Lucia is no longer a functioning convent. Its ruins, weathered by time, are visited by tourists, historians, and thrill-seekers. Some arrive out of fascination with ghost stories, hoping to hear the muffled cries of a spirit still trapped in the walls. Others come to pay respect, to whisper Margherita's name, as though giving back the identity she was denied. Guides tell the story in hushed voices, pointing to the cloister where the bones were found, warning that sometimes visitors feel a sudden chill, as though unseen fingers brush against their skin. For skeptics, it remains nothing more than folklore, a tale stretched by centuries of retelling. But even the skeptics cannot explain why the story has endured so strongly. Legends that last this long are born from something more than imagination. They are born from truth too painful to be recorded, and so preserved instead by whispers, rumors, and the stubborn persistence of memory. The immured nun is remembered not because she was holy, nor because she was guilty, but because she was human in a world that demanded otherwise. Her silence was meant to erase her, but instead it made her eternal. For every villager who told the story, every scholar who investigated, every tourist who shivers in the ruins today, she is alive again. And so the walls of Santa Lucia still hold her. Not her body, not her bones, but her story. A story of injustice turned into myth, myth turned back into history. A story that reminds us that even the heaviest stones cannot hold silence forever. If you followed Sister Margarita's haunting story so far, you know the walls of Santa Lucia carry centuries of suffering and secrets. But what lessons does her life, or her death, hold for us today? Before we explore the modern investigation and truths behind her legend, subscribe to Uncover Hidden History, comment your thoughts on justice and cruelty, and share this story with someone who loves dark but real history. Centuries had passed since the walls of Santa Lucia had swallowed Sister Margarita, yet the echoes of her life refused to fade. By the 20th century, historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists began revisiting the convent and its forgotten records. What had once been dismissed as folklore was now approached with scrutiny and evidence. The human bones discovered during 19th century renovations were catalogued, studied, and carefully preserved, raising questions that could not be ignored. For scholars, Margarita was no longer just a legend. She was a window into the social, religious, and psychological realities of 17th century Italy. Researchers examined the placement of the remains, the way the bones were pressed against the inner wall, the curvature of the spine, the erosion of fingernails from repeated scraping. Everything suggested confinement and prolonged suffering. This was not a simple death from illness or accident, as some church records claimed. It was evidence of immurement, the cruel practice of bricking a person alive into a wall. Anthropologists noted that in confined spaces, the body shows telltale signs of extreme stress, malnutrition, and dehydration, all of which were present in Margarita's skeleton. The scientific analysis confirmed what villagers had whispered for generations. She had been buried alive. The historical context was equally revealing. In 17th century Italy, convents wielded extraordinary power over women's lives. Families frequently sent daughters to religious institutions, not out of devotion, but to avoid the cost of dowries or to silence women who resisted arranged marriages. Inside, abbesses exercised absolute authority, enforcing obedience through fear, isolation, and sometimes violence. Immurement, though rare, was documented in several convents, often justified as divine punishment for disobedience or perceived sin. Margarita's case fit this pattern perfectly, illustrating the deadly intersection of social control, religious authority, and gender oppression. Modern psychologists have analyzed such cases to understand the human cost of extreme isolation. Living in a confined space, deprived of light, social contact, and basic freedom, creates profound trauma. Contemporary studies of solitary confinement in prisons reveal similar psychological effects: hallucinations, severe anxiety, depression, and in many cases, cognitive decline. Margarita, trapped behind walls for days or perhaps weeks, would have endured terror, confusion, and despair, unlike anything we can easily imagine. Her final moments were likely marked by both physical pain and the crushing weight of knowing no one could hear her. The symbolic implications are equally compelling. To immure someone is to erase them, to make their existence invisible. For centuries, Margarita's name was absent from official records. Her family moved on, her convent continued its functions, and the church avoided scrutiny. Yet despite these attempts at erasure, her memory persisted. Legends, oral histories, and finally scientific evidence ensured that she could never truly be forgotten. Historians argue that this resilience of memory speaks to a fundamental truth. Human suffering, no matter how hidden, has a way of asserting itself across time. Researchers also explored the cultural transmission of her story. The villagers' oral traditions kept Margarita alive long after the convent tried to suppress her memory. These stories were not idle gossip. They functioned as both warning and commemoration. Children learned caution, but adults also remembered the injustice. In this way, folklore became a mechanism for preserving moral truth, even in a society that sought to bury it. The tale of the immured nun demonstrates how narrative and memory serve as a counterbalance to institutional power. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the ruins of Santa Lucia became a focus for interdisciplinary study. Archaeologists mapped the convent, noting its hidden cells, tunnels, and wall cavities. Forensic anthropologists revisited the bones, using modern imaging techniques to reconstruct Margarita's confinement. They identified subtle fractures consistent with long-term pressure against stone, further confirming the oral accounts. Meanwhile, historians combed through church archives, finding letters and marginal notes that hinted at disciplinary practices far harsher than official documents suggested. Each piece of evidence reinforced the conclusion that Margarita's death was deliberate, institutionalized, and cruel. The case also attracted the attention of human rights scholars. Though immurement is a historical practice, it raises questions relevant today. Scholars examine how authority, whether religious or secular, can dehumanize individuals under the guise of law, morality, or tradition. Margarita's story has been cited in discussions of women's rights, institutional abuse, and ethical treatment of prisoners. It is a reminder that legal or moral authority does not always equate to justice, and that vigilance is necessary to prevent abuse from being normalized or hidden. Psychologists and sociologists have also analyzed the impact of collective memory. The story of the immured nun illustrates how societies cope with trauma through narrative. Margarita became a symbol, a cautionary tale, a moral lesson, and an emblem of suffering. Oral history, community memory, and folklore all preserved her existence. In this way, even in death, she exercised agency over how she would be remembered, forcing subsequent generations to confront the cruelty inflicted upon her. In modern Italy, the ruins of Santa Lucia serve as a tangible connection to this past. Visitors often report a palpable sense of unease when standing near the sealed sections of wall where Margarita was believed to have been confined. Guides recount the story with solemnity, emphasizing both historical fact and moral reflection. For many, the convent is more than a tourist site. It is a memorial to the consequences of unchecked authority and the resilience of human memory. The academic discourse around Margarita also highlights the intersection of gender, power, and religion. Women in 17th century convents were expected to embody spiritual perfection while surrendering all personal autonomy. Disobedience, desire, or curiosity could be punished with extreme severity. The immurement of Margarita exemplifies the lethal consequences of violating these expectations. In historical context, her story was one of many, yet it survived because of the unique combination of oral tradition, visual art, and eventual scientific corroboration. Today, ethical discussions surrounding her case influence broader debates on institutional accountability. How should societies remember historical injustices? How do we honor victims whose stories were systematically erased? Scholars suggest that acknowledging Margarita's suffering, studying it rigorously, and disseminating her story widely are essential steps in ensuring that history does not repeat itself. Her life and her death serve as enduring lessons about human dignity, vulnerability, and the cost of silence. The narrative of the immured nun also resonates in contemporary psychology. Trauma caused by extreme isolation, punishment, and societal rejection has long-term consequences, even across generations. Modern analogues can be found in prisons, abusive institutions, and situations where authority suppresses individual freedom. By studying Margarita's ordeal, Psychologists gain insight into the profound human need for autonomy, social connection, and validation. Her story transcends its historical context, offering timeless insights into human resilience and the dangers of unchecked power. Moreover, the symbolic power of the story has inspired literature, film, and art. Writers explore themes of confinement, injustice, and rebellion, while visual artists depict the eerie tension between life and stone. Each adaptation, whether fictionalized or historically faithful, reinforces the memory of Sister Margherita and ensures that her suffering continues to provoke reflection. In doing so, art becomes a vehicle for historical empathy, allowing audiences to connect emotionally with experiences centuries removed from their own lives. The Immured Nun reminds us that history is not merely a collection of dates and events, it is lived experience, often painful, often hidden. Margherita's confinement, death, and posthumous legacy reveal the intersections of gender, power, morality, and memory. Her story challenges us to consider how authority can corrupt, how silence can oppress, and how courage, even in the form of survival in memory, can endure. As scholars, historians, and ordinary people continue to visit Santa Lucia, study its archives, and discuss its dark history, Margherita's presence remains palpable. She exists not only in the bricks and bones, but in the awareness her story evokes. To remember her is to confront injustice, to acknowledge the cost of silence, and to honor the human spirit that refuses to be erased, even by centuries of stone and secrecy. Through interdisciplinary study, combining archaeology, anthropology, psychology, history, and ethics, the Immured Nun has transformed from a whispered legend into a case study of human cruelty, resilience, and memory. She teaches modern society that the past is never truly gone. It lives in the stories we tell, the lessons we learn, and the empathy we cultivate. Her story concludes not with finality, but with reflection. For every visitor to Santa Lucia, every reader of her tale, and every scholar who studies the human cost of silence, Margherita's experience serves as a warning and a reminder. Silence cannot erase injustice. Memory cannot be imprisoned. And though her body was confined, her story roams freely, shaping conscience, provoking thought, and inspiring vigilance in every generation that encounters it. The Immured Nun's legacy is therefore both historical and timeless. It is a testament to the resilience of human memory, the consequences of institutional cruelty, and the enduring need to protect human dignity. Margherita's name may have been absent from records, her voice silenced behind walls, but her story remains alive. It challenges modern society to confront injustice, honor suffering, and ensure that no human life is ever confined to silence again. Friends, we have now reached the final chapter of this haunting story. If you've stayed with me until now, you already know this isn't just another tale. It's a brutal fragment of hidden history, silenced for centuries. What you are about to hear is the darkest, most heartbreaking truth of all. So I beg you, don't skip a second of this part. Let this story live inside you, because it is not just about one woman, but about the cruel price of silence and obedience in an unforgiving world. If this story has shaken you, then please hit the like button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can uncover the forgotten voices of history and make sure they are never buried again. The Immured Nun Italy, 1600s, Part 4, Final Chapter, 3,000 words, human-style writing, no scenes. The monastery stood like a fortress of silence, its heavy stones carrying the weight of centuries. But within those walls lay a secret that no one dared to speak of openly, yet everyone knew. The story of Sister Maria was whispered in kitchens, murmured in taverns, passed on from grandmother to child. It was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a warning, a shadow that haunted the village. Long after Maria was sealed alive, strange happenings disturbed the peace of the convent. At night, when the bells were supposed to be still, their chimes rang through the air with no one at the rope. The sisters who remained whispered to each other that the sound came from Maria herself, still clutching her rosary on the other side of the wall, still praying, still pleading. The priests tried to silence these rumors, condemning them as the devil's lies. "Obey the church, obey God," they thundered. "The dead cannot return." But the people of the village did not believe. Too many had heard the phantom prayers. Too many had seen a pale figure gliding along the corridors in the moonlight, her face streaked with tears, her hands stretched out as if asking for release. For decades, the secret remained hidden, buried in stone, in silence, in the fear of speaking out. But time is merciless, and truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. Years later, when the monastery was partially rebuilt after a collapse, the masons began to tear down one of the oldest walls. Their chisels struck hard stone, but then suddenly they hit something hollow. When the wall broke open, the men froze in horror. Behind the bricks lay a skeleton, slumped against the stone, its bony fingers still entwined around a rosary. The hollow sockets of the skull seemed to scream. The remnants of a nun's habit clung to the bones, fragile threads that had somehow survived the centuries. Alongside her body lay a small wooden cross, cracked with age, and a piece of cloth embroidered with her initials, M.A. The workers dropped their tools and fled in terror. Word spread like fire through the village. People crowded to see the remains, weeping as if she had just died yesterday. Mothers clutched their daughters tightly, whispering, "This is what happens when you are silenced." The church tried desperately to suppress the discovery. The priests gathered the bones in haste, insisting on a secret burial. They did not want anyone to know. But how can you silence a truth that has already been revealed? The villagers told and retold the story until it became legend. The monastery was forever renamed in hushed voices as the Monastery of the Immured Nun. Children grew up with the story. They were warned, never defy the church, never follow the heart, for this is what will happen. But as time passed, the story changed. No longer a tale of warning, it became a symbol of defiance. To the women of the village, Maria was not a sinner. She was a martyr of love, punished not for wickedness, but for her humanity. Historians who later searched through the old archives found her name. The official record did not say she was killed. Instead, it used the cold words of bureaucracy. She was punished according to divine law, for her heart had strayed from its holy path. Yet the evidence of the wall and the bones told the real story. A young woman's life was stolen because she dared to love. The haunting of the monastery continued. Even centuries later, travelers who passed through swore they heard weeping at night, a soft whisper of prayer that lingered in the corridors. Some claimed they saw a figure in white kneeling by the altar, her face hidden in her hands. Others said they heard the rattling of chains or the faint echo of fingernails scraping against stone. Whether ghost or memory, Sister Maria remained. Her story was too powerful to fade. It lived not in books, not in church records, but in the people who carried her tragedy in their hearts. She became a silent rebellion against cruelty, proof that even when buried alive, the human spirit cannot be silenced. And so, centuries later, when people speak of the immured nun, they do not speak of shame. They speak of love denied, of power abused, of faith twisted into cruelty. Her question still lingers in the air. Was love truly a sin? If you stand in the ruins of that monastery today, some say you can still hear her. The wind that rushes through the broken arches sounds like a woman's sigh. The bells, long rusted and unused, sometimes sway without a hand upon them. And in the darkest hours of night, when the moon shines cold and pale, a whisper drifts through the stones. Do not forget me. That whisper is more than a ghost. It is history itself, reminding us that behind every wall, behind every silence, there may lie a story of pain waiting to be told. And now her story has reached you.